The reduction in standards and import controls associated with Brexit has contributed to the rise in foodborne illnesses in recent months, according to health experts across the Channel. Has Brexit contributed to the rise in food poisoning cases across the whole area? Well, in any case, this is one of the ways suggested by health experts to explain the unprecedented rise in foodborne illnesses seen in England for several months, as The Guardian reports. According to the NHS, the United Kingdom's public health system, 1,468 hospital admissions for salmonella infections were recorded between April 22 and March 23. That's a rate of 3 admissions per 100,000 people, and that's a record. Cases of contamination with E. coli bacteria and campylobacteriosis are also reaching unprecedented levels, with 4,340 hospitalizations in the last 2 years. And this equates to a rate of 9 people per 100,000 in 23, compared to 3 per 100,000 in 2000. The causes of the increase in foodborne contamination are discussed, and while the British Food Safety Authority mainly explains this with the progress made in recent years in detecting these diseases, other experts cite several factors, including the decline in the resources of local health authorities, but also the reduction in regulations and the import controls since Brexit. Tim Lang, Professor of Food Policy at the Centre for Food Policy at the City University of London, quotes the British Daily and explains that this situation is due to the state's disinterest in the issue of hygiene and food safety, and that this has been worsened by Brexit. After leaving the European Union in 2020, the United Kingdom and the European Union should introduce a range of import checks from January 1st in 2021. The EU introduced them all at this point, and this is not the case with the British, who rejected them several times for fear that they would destabilize the economy. This particularly affected health and phytosanitary controls on agricultural food, which ultimately only came into force at the end of January 24. After several contamination cases last year, the Food Standards Agency said it was investigating possible poisonings linked to imports of poultry and eggs from Poland. James Motterhead, the chief executive of the NFU Poultry Producers, an organization representing more than 45,000 farming businesses, found it deeply concerning to see poultry products produced outside the UK being imported from countries where salmonella cases are increasing. But if and when the Labour Party takes office, it will anyway come under pressure to negotiate a much better Brexit deal than that bequeathed by Boris Johnson. But the political situation in both the UK and the EU will make that task very difficult. The agreement on the Windsor Framework in February 23, which sorted out some of the difficulties of the Northern Ireland Protocol, softened the antagonism between London and Brussels. But the governing Conservatives remain profoundly Eurosceptic, and a real reset of UK-EU relations must await the arrival of a Labour government, obviously. There are at least 3 reasons to revisit the relationship. First, public opinion in the UK has shifted markedly. According to polling by the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, 18% of those who voted leave now regret leaving the EU. And more strikingly, 78% of Britons want the UK to have a closer relationship with the EU than it has now. That includes 71% of leave voters. Second, the economic damage inflicted by Johnson's Brexit deal is becoming ever more apparent. Friction at borders, labour shortages, regulatory uncertainty, and upward pressure on prices. The Centre for European Reform's calculations suggest that the British economy is 5.5% smaller than that of a constructed doppelganger UK that did not leave the EU. Both investments and goods trades are 10 to 15% lower than they would have been without Brexit. Third, the world has changed since the Brexit treaties were negotiated. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the growing tensions between the US and China have created an increasingly uncertain geopolitical context. New types of cross-border challenge are emerging, such as how to regulate AI, encourage collaboration in pursuit of net zero emissions, and make supply chains less vulnerable. Having similar interests in this potentially more unstable world, the UK and the EU would benefit from closer cooperation. Keir Starmer and most of his chief lieutenants are instinctively pro-European but also very cautious. Starmer has made clear that he would not rejoin the single market or the customs union or restore freedom of movement. He and his political advisors are focused on winning back the so-called Red Wall seats in the North and the Midlands that went Conservative at the 2019 election. They believe that if the political argument centers on Europe, many voters will be reminded of their strong Leaver identity and end up voting Conservative. Hence the reluctance of the Labour leadership to talk very much or very warmly about the EU. Labour leaders have made it clear that they want to improve the EU-UK relationship, for example, by adopting EU standards on plant and animal health, making it easier for Britons to work for short periods in the EU without a visa, and forging closer ties on foreign and defence policy. However, a Labour government may well find the EU hard to deal with. EU leaders have a lot on their plate: the war in Ukraine, the renewed momentum for EU enlargement, strained relations with China, arguments with the US over industrial policy, the growing backlash against green legislation, and the lack of respect for the rule of law in certain member states. The last thing that most politicians and officials want to think about is Brexit, which bored them to death for many years. Although the current problems in the relationship, such as frictions at the borders, affect or will affect both sides, but Britain is much more dependent on trade with the EU than vice versa. A reset will matter more for the UK, so a Labour government will need to think carefully about what it can offer the EU to encourage it to change the current arrangements. EU leaders have not forgotten the chaotic and fickle behavior of Johnson, who repeatedly threatened to tear up the withdrawal agreement that he had negotiated with them. And they know that Starmer is not to blame for the shenanigans of Johnson's government, but worry that a Europhobic Conservative Party could return to power in 2028 or 29. And they also think that the UK press may be capable of deflecting any British government from a pro-EU course. They have noticed the caution with which Labour frontbenchers talk about the EU, and thus a Labour government will start with a large credibility problem. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here on the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.